Because how much do you want to be accepted by everybody?
It's logical that, if you're around, if you're successful for a long period of time, that you are going to become accepted, by everybody eventually,
Brian Jones didn't die at the height of fame. He didn't die surrounded by applause, cameras, or adoration. He died alone, pushed out of the band he created. For decades, the story has sounded simple: a tragic accident, a troubled genius who couldn't escape his demons, a sad but inevitable ending to a chaotic life. That version is familiar, comfortable, easy to accept, but it leaves too much unexplained. Was it really just an accident? Was it negligence, people failing to protect a man who was clearly unraveling? Or was there something else happening beneath the surface, something quietly ignored? Because when you look closely, the most disturbing part of Brian Jones's story isn't what happened in the swimming pool, it's what happened before it. The isolation, the betrayal, the slow removal of power, purpose, and identity. By the time the headlines appeared, Brian Jones had already lost everything that defined him: his band, his voice, his place in history. And that's the part most people never talk about. Because by the time Brian Jones died, he had already been erased. Before we continue, if you love the stories of Mick Jagger and Rolling Stones and want to help keep his legacy alive, subscribe to this channel, like, and share. Before the Rolling Stones became a global phenomenon, before stadiums and scandals, there was one man quietly pulling the strings. Brian Jones wasn't just a guitarist, he was the architect. In the early 1960s, Brian was the one who lived and breathed American blues. He hunted down records, memorized styles, and absorbed sounds most British musicians hadn't even heard yet. While others flirted with the image of rebellion, Brian studied the roots of it. Slide guitar, harmonica, marimba, sitar, if it made a sound, he could make it sing. More importantly, he assembled the band. He found Mick Jagger. He brought in Keith Richards. He shaped the early direction of what would soon be known as the Rolling Stones. In those formative years, Brian wasn't just part of the group, he was the group. Early recordings and performances revolved around his musical instincts. When the Stones needed texture, Brian delivered. When they needed identity, he provided it. On stage, his presence was magnetic, almost fragile, but impossible to ignore. Off stage, he pushed relentlessly, demanding authenticity at a time when British pop still played it safe. But power inside a band is never permanent. As the Stones grew louder, richer, and more ambitious, something subtle began to shift. Leadership started to change hands. Credit followed success. And Brian, once at the center of everything, began to feel the ground move beneath his feet. He built the machine, but soon, it was moving without him. Success changes everything, especially who gets heard. As the Rolling Stones climbed through the mid-1960s, a new power structure quietly formed. Mick Jagger and Keith Richards began writing more songs together. Their partnership tightened. Their confidence grew, and with every hit, their influence inside the band expanded. Brian Jones noticed. Where once decisions passed through him, they now happened around him. Studio conversations shifted. Creative authority migrated. The band no longer revolved around textures and experimentation, it revolved around songwriting credits, radio dominance, and control. Brian wasn't pushed out overnight. He was outpaced. His interest drifted towards sonic exploration, while the band locked into a more focused, commercially explosive sound. He added colors. They wanted hits. And gradually, those two visions stopped aligning. Tensions grew. Brian's behavior became erratic. He missed sessions. He showed up late. Sometimes, he didn't show up at all. Each absence made it easier for others to step into a space, not maliciously, but inevitably. And when Brian was present, the atmosphere had changed. He wasn't leading anymore. He was contributing when allowed. That loss of authority hit him deeply. Brian had defined himself through music, through relevance, through being needed. Watching the band succeed without depending on him felt like a quiet betrayal, even if no one ever said the words out loud. The Rolling Stones didn't turn on Brian Jones in one dramatic moment. They simply learned how to function without him. And that realization would haunt Brian more than any argument ever could. By the late 1960s, Brian Jones was unraveling slowly at first, then all at once. Legal troubles mounted, arrests followed, court dates became routine. Each incident made touring more difficult, recording more uncertain, and patience thinner. While the band pushed forward at full speed, Brian struggled just to keep pace. Drugs didn't cause the isolation, they fed it. Substances dulled the pain of losing control but amplified his unreliability. Sessions passed without him. Tours were planned with contingency ideas. Other musicians quietly filled in parts Brian once would have played himself. The most devastating part wasn't being criticized. It was being replaced without announcement. On recordings, Brian's contributions became smaller, more sporadic. Sometimes he'd add a flourish, sometimes nothing at all. Songs no longer depended on him. The Stones had learned to work around his absence, a survival skill that slowly turned into a habit. And Brian felt it. He was still officially in the band, but emotionally and creatively, he had already been sidelined. Conversations happened elsewhere. Decisions were finalized without his input. He became a ghost inside his own creation. Friends noticed the change. Brian grew withdrawn, paranoid, deeply wounded. The man who once commanded the room now drifted at the edges, watching the band he founded accelerate toward a future that no longer included him. By the time anyone acknowledged the truth, it was already too late. Brian Jones hadn't just lost his role, he had lost his purpose. And the fall was about to become irreversible. The moment Brian Jones was officially removed from the Rolling Stones was quiet. No shouting, no dramatic confrontation, just a cold, final decision. By the summer of 1969, the band had already made up its mind. Brian's legal troubles made traveling risky. His reliability was questioned. His presence was seen as a liability. And so, without ceremony, the founder was dismissed from the very group he had built. The announcement was carefully worded, polite, almost gentle. It spoke of mutual understanding and creative differences, but behind those words was something far harsher. Brian Jones was no longer useful. For Brian, the blow was devastating. The Rolling Stones weren't just a band, they were his identity. Being removed meant more than losing a job. It meant losing relevance, purpose, and belonging in one stroke. Friends later recalled how stunned he seemed afterward. Not angry, not explosive, just hollow, as if he couldn't quite grasp how quickly everything had ended. The band moved on immediately. Rehearsals continued, plans advanced. A new guitarist stepped into Brian's place without hesitation. Brian, meanwhile, was left behind in silence. He wasn't invited into the future. He was written out of it. And that sudden erasure pushed him into a solitude he was completely unprepared to survive. After being expelled from the band, Brian Jones retreated to Cotchford Farm, a quiet, secluded property in Sussex that once belonged to A. Milne, the creator of Winnie the Pooh. On paper, it sounded idyllic. In reality, it became a place of isolation. Brian told people he wanted a fresh start. He spoke of new music, new collaborations, and reclaiming his independence. But those close to him noticed the cracks almost immediately. The house was rarely empty. People drifted in and out, friends, acquaintances, hangers-on. Some were supportive, others were careless. A few were deeply problematic. Boundaries blurred. Control slipped. Brian's physical health deteriorated. Years of substance use had taken their toll. He was frail, exhausted, and emotionally fragile. And yet, despite obvious warning signs, there was no real structure around him, no supervision, no one firmly in charge. What looked like freedom was actually abandonment. At Cotchford Farm, Brian was no longer protected by managers, schedules, or even expectations. He was left to manage his own decline in an environment that quietly encouraged chaos. And as the Stones prepared for their next chapter, rehearsing, planning, moving forward, Brian remained frozen in place, surrounded by people who didn't fully grasp how vulnerable he had become. The stage was set, and no one stopped what was coming. The night Brian Jones died did not begin with drama. It began like many others at Cotchford Farm, late hours, lingering conversations, alcohol, exhaustion. People were present, yet accountability was strangely absent. Sometime after midnight, Brian ended up in the swimming pool. What followed has been debated for decades. The official conclusion described it as a tragic accident. Brian, under the influence, drowned. Case closed. But almost immediately, inconsistencies surfaced. Witness accounts conflicted. Timelines didn't align. Statements shifted over time. Details that should have been clear were suddenly vague. And perhaps most unsettling of all, the initial investigation was remarkably brief. There was no deep forensic analysis, no aggressive questioning, no attempt to reconstruct the final moments with precision. The assumption of accident was accepted quickly, almost eagerly. Brian Jones was declared dead in the early hours of July. He was 27 years old. The world mourned briefly. Headlines framed the loss as inevitable, another brilliant musician destroyed by excess. But beneath the surface, doubts refused to fade. Because the more closely people examined that night, the more uncomfortable questions emerged. And the official story began to feel less like an answer, and more like an ending chosen for convenience. In the days following Brian Jones's death, attention moved quickly away from people and toward conclusions. There was one figure present that night whose role never received the scrutiny many expected. Someone close enough to witness events unfold, yet distant enough to avoid sustained questioning. In the confusion, his version of events became the backbone of the official narrative. But that version didn't stay consistent. Over the years, details changed, timelines shifted, small facts were remembered differently depending on when and where the story was told. None of these contradictions alone proved anything, but together they created unease. Why did certain statements evolve? Why were key moments left vague? Why did some questions never get asked at all? Those who later examined the case noted how quickly the focus turned away from accountability. The investigation accepted surface explanations and moved on. No deep dive into dynamics at the house. No serious examination of responsibility. Brian Jones, already labeled as troubled, became his own explanation. And that made things easier for everyone else. Because once someone is framed as unstable, their death stops being mysterious. It becomes expected, almost justified. But history has shown that the most convenient explanations are often the least complete. And decades later, people began wondering whether the real mystery wasn't what happened in the pool, but why so few seemed interested in knowing more. Time didn't close the questions. It sharpened them. As years passed, journalists, writers, and independent researchers began revisiting Brian Jones's final days. They weren't driven by conspiracy, they were driven by absence, missing clarity, missing rigor, missing answers. Books emerged. Testimonies resurfaced. People who had stayed silent for decades suddenly spoke. Some claimed guilt had been ignored. Others suggested that negligence was disguised as inevitability. The most troubling discovery wasn't a single new fact. It was how thin the original investigation had been. No full reconstruction, no sustained pressure, no serious attempt to challenge early assumptions. The case had been closed, not because it was solved, but because it was uncomfortable. Authorities briefly reopened discussions years later, but without definitive new evidence, nothing changed officially. Still, the doubt remained. Once introduced, it couldn't be erased. Brian Jones became part of a growing list of cultural figures whose death sat in a gray zone, not clearly accidental, not legally criminal, but deeply unresolved. And unresolved stories have a strange power. They refuse to settle. They demand attention, especially when the person at the center of them had already been pushed aside, dismissed, and silenced long before the final moment. Perhaps the most unsettling truth is this: Brian Jones didn't lose his life first. He lost his place. Long before Cotchford Farm, long before the pool, long before the headlines, Brian had already been removed from the narrative that once revolved around him. The band continued. The machine rolled on. Tours, records, and success accelerated, and Brian became a footnote, a cautionary tale, a ghost. In that sense, his death felt almost symbolic, the final confirmation of an erasure that had already taken place. The Rolling Stones rarely spoke about him afterward. When they did, it was brief, controlled, respectful, but distant. The story moved forward without reopening old wounds. And the world accepted it. Brian Jones became the tragic founder who couldn't keep up, the brilliant mind who burned out, the inevitable loss. But inevitability is often a story we tell ourselves after the fact. Because when you strip away the mythology, what remains is a man who was isolated, dismissed, and left vulnerable at the worst possible moment. Whether his death was an accident, negligence, or something darker may never be fully answered. But one thing is certain: by the time Brian Jones died, he had already been left behind. After Brian Jones's death, something strange happened. The noise stopped. There were no long explanations, no detailed reflections, no public reckoning. The band moved forward almost immediately, as if pausing too long might invite questions no one wanted to answer. A memorial concert came and went. New music arrived. A new era began. Brian's name faded from interviews. His role was reduced to a brief origin story, the troubled founder who couldn't survive the lifestyle. It was a clean narrative, easy to repeat, easier still to leave untouched. But silence can be revealing. Because when someone matters deeply, their absence is discussed, examined, mourned. In Brian's case, it was compartmentalized, a tragedy acknowledged, then sealed off. Years later, when the Stones reflected on their history, Brian was spoken of carefully, with distance, with restraint, rarely with detail. It was as if revisiting that chapter risked reopening something unresolved. And perhaps it did. Because Brian Jones represents an uncomfortable truth that even legendary bands can abandon their own. That success doesn't pause for vulnerability, that when power shifts, compassion often follows last. The silence wasn't proof of guilt, but it was proof of discomfort. And discomfort usually means something was left unfinished. Brian Jones's story was never just about excess or self-destruction. It was about displacement. He built something extraordinary, then watched it evolve beyond him. When he became inconvenient emotionally, legally, creatively, he was removed, isolated, and left to manage the fallout alone. His death, whatever the final truth may be, sits at the end of a long chain of abandonment. A moment that shocked the world, but followed months, even years, of quiet erasure. Was it an accident? Was it negligence? Was it something darker? We may never know. But what we do know is this: Brian Jones did not die surrounded by support. He died after losing his place, his voice, and his sense of belonging. And that makes his story more than a mystery. It makes it a warning. Because some tragedies don't begin with a single moment, they begin when people stop paying attention. So let me ask you, do you believe Brian Jones's death was simply a tragic accident or the result of everything that came before it? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you value deep, cinematic stories about music, power, and the chapter's history prefers to rush past, like this video and subscribe to the channel. Because the most important truths are often found not in the headlines, but in the silence that follows.